The previous talks, I sort of went, wow, and really it'd be great if that technology was available to the people I work with in Nepal. The trouble is, and the OXL stack was a fantastic diagram, because right down the bottom is the foundation of Unicode, and you can't get into the game unless you've got the foundation, and that's the problem in Nepal. So we're going to talk a bit about this foundation standard Unicode, and for very small languages that really aren't there. And what I'll do is to talk a bit about the background of languages in Nepal, just to set the scene, and then focus in on one language where everybody agrees it really ought to be in there, but it ain't. And then we'll think about why it isn't and what we can do about it. Okay, the catalogue of languages is produced by the Summer Institute of Linguistics in the Ethnologue, and it's the definitive list of languages, and gives just over 6,900 languages globally. What I was interested in is really how many of these are written, and what should we reasonably expect about languages being written and being included in Unicode. And I went to Nick Ostler, who's the Foundation for Endangered Languages, who's also written the definitive book about the major languages of the world called Empires of the Word. And he pointed me to an article by Trond, who had gone through the Ethnologue and said, well, Sil does fantastic work on languages and documenting them, but their agenda is to translate the Bible. And what languages have they thought it worth translating the Bible for? So he went through the thing, and either the whole Bible or fragments of it were translated into just over 2,000 languages. Okay, and that's about a third of all languages. And he then checked out, said if the speaker population is something like 16,000, then on the average, that's what Sil thinks it's worth doing for. So maybe if we have a language of that size or greater, we could reasonably expect it to be written and encoded in Unicode. Okay, and then of course all the knowledge is available to it, all those wonderful tools. Okay. Nepal itself is about 30 million people or something now. The national language is Nepali, which is an Indo-Aryan language. It used to be the only language that was allowed in the country. All education happened through Nepali. And so, of course, most of the population actually speak Nepali. Maybe don't read it all that well, but they speak it. And because of the language shifts, something like half the population would now claim Nepali as their mother tongue. However, there are 124 languages, living languages in Nepal listed in the Ethnologue. In the 2001 census, there were 92, and the numbers grown partly just because they focused on dialects and separated things which were seen previously as single languages. So 124 languages, two major groups, the Tibeto-Burman of the sort of Chinese orientation and the Indo-Aryan of the sort of Indian, European orientation. Going into the list of languages, there's some 28 languages which have speaker populations of 16,000 or greater. Okay. 8 of these are, and the figures in the documentation slightly disagree because I missed out one language. The 8 languages are across the border. Okay, so the major populations are in India, so you'd expect linguistic support to come from India. But that leaves 20 of these languages of more than 16,000 speakers purely in Nepal, and of these only 4 or 3 have any really serious written tradition. So we've got a long way to go. The dominant language, Nepali, with 11 million plus speakers, that's okay. It's been used for maybe 250 years. So it's got a good tradition. All administration happens in Nepali and so on. And because it's written in Devanagari, it's present in Unicode, and right from the beginning. Newar, which is about the 5th language, something like that, it's been written for well over 1,000 years, okay, because it was the language of the traditional rulers of the Kathmandu Valley and the neighborhood. It's got some traditional forms of writing, but these are nowhere in Unicode, and that's what we're going to come back to later. There's another smaller language, 1/3 of a million speakers, and they have a traditional writing system which was just used in a few traditional and religious texts. Started about the 17th century. It got into Unicode in 2004 because of an enthusiastic field linguist. The cross-border languages, just to think, Nepali, which is sort of recognized as a separate language in India, has a major population, 10 times the size of the one in Nepal, who use the language, a very mature written tradition. They write in Devanagari, but they actually have a traditional script, which is just slowly beginning to get accepted. Bhojpuri, which is the one I left out in my the written paper, that's got a very large population in India, and is actually the dominant language in Mauritius, and also a strong tradition, a traditional script, again, a script that's not recognized. And then Lepcha, which is, it's a Buddhist text in it, and enthusiasts got into Unicode in 2008. Okay? So you need some Western enthusiasts to get anywhere. I wanted to just stop and say a little bit about the writing in South Asia, because it's somewhat different. It all goes back to a couple of thousand years to a Brahmi script, and everything was derived from that. And it's not clear whether Brahmi was separately invented or whether it, got ideas from the what people call Western Asia or the Middle East. So they all look a bit like the things down below. These, the two bodies of text, and on the right there's Devanagari, which is used in Hindi and so on. It's probably most people here would recognize that. And on the left is the Sirijanga script for Limbu. They both, in fact, are for us from a child's book, storybook, in the Limbu language. And they're parallel texts, and actually there's more or less a one-to-one correspondence between characters. And so you might really ask yourself the question at the bottom, why aren't these the same encoding with a font difference? What's the difference between a font and a script? But they have separate code tables, code blocks in Unicode. The writing itself is different from the Roman alphabet that we are familiar with. There's an implicit R in the consonants, and so on the right there's a ma and a pa, okay, and it's implicit, and so if you want a different vowel associated with it, there are diacritics to do that change. But the key thing I wanted to just point out here is this use of ligatures, of conjuncts, of bringing consonant clustered together, where in the top line they bring by sort of truncating and squeezing them laterally, and in the second example, they get squeezed vertically. Okay? But it's a very, very important characteristic, and the consonant in between is suppressed. The vowel in between is suppressed. Okay. So that's the writing we've done. And of course the language activists have been terribly keen to assert their own uniqueness, and with the changes in Nepal that happened from 1990 onwards, and liberalization of language policies, people were able to use their own language, write their own language, do it publicly, and so they wanted their writing to look different. They certainly didn't want it to look like Devanagari, which of course was the language of the writing of the traditional oppressors. Oppressors is probably not the wrong word, but the dominant cultural group, the Nepali speakers and writers. And so there'll be lots of inventions, and I've got them on the right there, some of them, the quite large linguistic communities. The second figure is the population in India, as people migrate. And some of these are also picked up in Sikkim, and I couldn't resist putting in this picture of the 11 editions of the Sikkim Herald, which is the official newspaper of the government of Sikkim, and in the 11 recognized languages of that particular part of India. They all try to look different. They look different in the writing, and they look different in the typography. Language activists are very proud and very important. What about the Newars? If you, people visited Nepal, if you go into any temple in Nepal, particularly in Kathmandu Valley, you'll see lots and lots of writing embossed on pillars or carved into wood, carved into stone. And there are two distinct writings that you'll see. One is on the right is Ranjana. So we'll see a bit of example in a moment. And on the left there's a different, rather more less decorative script, which people could now call Prachalit. So, I mean, with the liberalization of communication, the ability to write their own newspapers, so you get newspapers now that are printed in the Newar language. And on the top you see the Ranjana script, which is very characteristic with these diagonal lines along the bottom. And in the body text, it's in Prachalit. It's a sort of rather more rounded, less ornate script, but it's this was printed, of course, using computer typesetting, but the fonts used for it would have been hack fonts. I don't know if people know about hack fonts, where as soon as desktop computers came to, yes, I know. So what's this on? It's all held together by sellotape. This one too. Thanks for sitting here. Sorry, that took me off around the hole. Basically hack fonts, people immediately, they got desktop computers, they produced fonts that would render scripts that looked like their own, they encodings they didn't think about, and they assigned characters to the keyboard, and whatever the keyboard produced they took. So if they took a pa in Devanagari, they gave it to the P key because they thought of phonetic keyboards, and it got the coding for P. Okay, so these don't exchange. It's a chaos, but actually they could print. That's what they do. There have been attempts to get into Unicode, and the first one, I was a bit involved in the precursor to this, to attempt to encode Nepali, the writing of Nepali in the Devanagari-like Tripita, adding 3 characters. And that went forward, but these 3 characters really were just seen as conjuncts and dismissed, and the sorting is different, but of course you handle sorting not in Unicode, but you handle it in the collation algorithms associated with Unicode. And so it was rejected, and I thought that was reasonable. At that time, we sort of got Michael Everson, who's the ISO rep from Ireland, involved, and he worked out some draft proposals, ideas on his website for both Ranjana and Prachalit, and he called the Ranjana one Newar and the Prachalit one Nepali. And Alan Tulada had a word with him and said, look, this is going to be politically difficult, because if you call something from the Newar community Nepali, the dominant community ain't going to like it. So he backed off, and I then was surprised in 2009 he came back in, funding from the Script Encoding Initiative in Berkeley, California. He took the view that if they look the same, they are the same. And in Tibet and in Bhutan, they are writing that is visually very similar to Ranjana. It's got these nice ornate strokes and so on. And so he was going to unify, make a common encoding for all of those. And then he very well went public on this, had web-based discussions, and got a lot of flack for this. People saying, no, how about Prachalit and so on. And he ended up by writing another report which said there needs to be some unification here, some bringing together of the writings for the Newar language. but he stopped short of saying, and Ranjana and Prachalit were the same. Again, it went quiet, and then in 2011 another person came in, Anshuman Pandey, who's ethnically Indian, but he was born in Europe and now lives and works in the US. And he's a historian, and so he wrote a proposal which he called Prachalit, which focused really on historical writings, because that's his area of expertise, and he's a great scholar. A couple of months later, he did an update where he changed the name, very few other details otherwise, from Prachalit to Newar. And that sparked an awful argument. About the same time, a group in Nepal, Newar, has also produced their own proposal, not expressed in the conventions of the ISO documents, but still it was coming from the community of living users. And there was a lot of disagreement. We'll go through 2 points of disagreement. One was the name, and the name, of course, of the code block is really invisible. That foundation down there, by the time you get up to the top, you don't see the foundation, you just use it. Okay, just like the walls here sit on the foundation, you don't know it's there. So the name is not visible, but nevertheless, it caused a lot of aggravation. The Newars caused the Newars are the traditional rulers of the Kathmandu Valley, and they call the Kathmandu Valley Nepal. And so they called their writing, well, the language Nepal Vasha, the language of the valley, and their writing Nepal Lipi, the writing of the script of the valley. The language, sorry, Vasha is the language of the valley. Okay, so because it uses the word script in the Nepal Lipi script, when we'll get down to the bottom line, Nepal Lipi, which was the proposal from the Manandar camp, wasn't acceptable because it says the word script. And they said this is daft. Nepal Lipi is really one word. And anyway, what about Katakana and Hiragana, where the Kana Gana part means script? But there's some recent history here where old Hungarian was going in for standardization, and they wanted to call it something that means incise script, and that was ruled out. And because of the recent history, Nepal Lipi is not on. Newar also is not on because the Newars want their encoding to cover all the related languages of Nepal. And if you say it's Newar, that's one ethnic community, it rules out the rest. So that really hasn't been settled. And that's an argument about the invisible. The other thing is, I think, much more serious linguistically, and that's to do with the nature of the language. There are 7 characters there which appear in the writing for aspirated and nasals and so on. I can't say these things, you hear them and so on. Probably that's like a good. Where the sort of nah and so on. But these are distinct for the Newars, and they write them in this way. And the way that it's written looks like conjuncts, and that's why a bit about conjuncts was earlier, of ligatures. And the way you speak them is, the way you write them is you write the one that you speak first above. Here the ha comes at the top. So if you were to speak those as conjuncts, you would have to say the na first, okay? And so, if you want to write the ha afterwards as a conjunct, you'd have to write it at the bottom. And Anshuman Pandey said, oh well, the silly Newars, they got it wrong. And so he ruled these out. However, the Manandar proposal includes them. And if you look at the phonology, it's attested by the phonology. And so I pointed this out on the web, internet-based discussions. And I got this very rounding reply: Unicode encodes writing, not language. And they demand written evidence. So one of the things the guys in Nepal do is to redesign those characters so they look different. That seems, and then use this, produce a number of documents to show them in action. But that seems to me to be daft. Anyway, so I was worried, what's going on here? I mean, it really is a mess, and there seems to be a lack of technical knowledge that understanding what happens in the migration from handwriting to computer writing, you add in extra things. And so in order to be able to tell the computer to render something as a cluster, as a conjunct, you have to tell it, whereas of course if you're handwriting you just know it. So they've introduced ways of doing that. And also had a fierce argument about typography and the separation of style and content. Because I took the view that Ranjana and Prachali, these two different styles of writing, was just separate fonts. And if I was preparing a document like a newspaper, I would want to defer my style decisions after the content. And this just does not seem to be understood by the experts on the discussion list. So there seems to be some lack of technical breadth. There's a disciplinary or interested communities difference. Western scholars who have access to the financial resources, participate in the communities, are often just interested in the antiquarian documents and the ancient things. And I've just recently had a debate on my email with a colleague, and there's only really tens of, maybe hundreds of users of these encodings. There are quite a lot of them in Unicode now, and all they want to do is to share images, and encoding just gives them a neat way of sharing images. Whereas, of course, living users, they want to do everything with the writing and create new documents and so on. And there are millions of them. So there seems to be that kind of social injustice thing happening as well. And there's also some perverse incentives. The funding from the research foundations in the US seems to be linked to the number of successful encodings they make. And so it's in their interest to see things as different, whereas it might well be in the interest of the community to see them as the same. So, you know, that's, again, so it seems to be a whole lot of things are going on. And now that's the context we've got to do things in. And what do we do next? And I'm in the process of preparing a consolidated proposal to bring in those extra consonants and so on. We're going to focus on, I'm going to focus on supporting all the Tibeto-Burman languages that are currently proposing writings and trying to unify them. I'm not sure whether the communities will like this. This probably leads us to a name something like Nepal, that be a writing of Nepal, the country, suppose a writing of Nepal, Kathmandu. And there's a key meeting at the end of October in northern Thailand. We'll at least try and get an outline document in for that to try and bring them together. Okay. Whether we change the process of standardization and all the vested interest in standardization, I don't think we'll try that. We just try and understand it and we'll live within it. Thanks.